Welcome to Chapter 6, Data Presenter Controls. This chapter will cover the data presenter family, data presenter architecture, binding to data, binding to XML, binding to an observable collection, adding data directly, adding unbound fields, and customizing the layout and presentation of fields. Additionally, this chapter will cover navigation and selection, tooltips while scrolling, sorting and grouping, adding, updating, and deleting records, row summaries, movable fields, fixed fields, header placement, and record filtering. This chapter contains 2 labs, one to cover the XAM Data Presenter control, and one to cover the XAM Data Grid. The XAM Data Grid and XAM Data Carousel are the controls which currently utilize the Data Presenter APIs. At the heart of this family is the XAM Data Presenter control. The XAM Data Presenter is programmed to present tabular and hierarchical data. Both the XAM Data Grid and XAM Data Carousel are XAM Data Presenters. Alternately, the XAM Data Presenter control is a hierarchical data-bound control, able to dynamically switch between different UI views of the data. Currently, the XAM Data Presenter provides 2 different views. The first is the grid view, which presents data in a tabular grid format, and the second is the carousel view, which utilizes the carousel format. XAM Data Presenter also allows for custom view interfaces to be created and added. The parts which make up the architecture of the Data Presenter include its record manager, records themselves, fields, editors, and presenters. The record manager is responsible for data record management. It coordinates data between the data source and the record collections used by the NetAdvantage for WPF controls derived from the Data Presenter base class. Additionally, all data records maintain a reference to their record manager. A record in its simplest sense can be thought of as a set of fields, where each field contains its own value. A common presentation for a record typically shows its cell values appearing side by side within a row. Data record objects are created to represent each item of data from the source collection. Expandable field record objects contain child records collections. Child records can appear within a completely different field layout than their parent record. Group by records are created to organize data using a hierarchical grouping strategy. Grouping operations are often initiated when the end user drags a group by field label into the group by area, with the intent of reorganizing the information. Fields describe general qualities about their piece of data in every record that include a locally unique name that distinguishes it from other fields of the same record, and an underlying data type that describes the .NET type of data values the cells of its records contain. Fields can generally be thought of as representing a column in a typical data grid format. Field labels should briefly explain the meaning of any values displayed in the cells affiliated with the field. By default, every field is automatically labeled with the name of your data's attribute. This may be a public property name, the local name of an XML node, or a data column name, depending on what data source you've used. If the default field names are not meant for your end users to see, you should set the label property on your field objects to a presentable name. When the auto-generate fields property is set to true, the field layout will be automatically generated based on the data source. Otherwise, the layout can be specified to create a custom layout of each field and its header. Field settings specify the type of data or formatting, the type of controller editor, the custom presentation for the content, and header labels to override the generated header name. By default, XAM editors are assigned to the fields. Field settings affect the assigned editor. The editor type can be overridden in the field settings. The data type can also be overridden in the field settings. Editors can be styled and formatted as well. Presenters allow field content to be customized in layout, definition, and in content presentation. The XAML shown here illustrates using a style to override a presenter in order to present data as an image element within a border. The XAM Data Grid supports binding to flat and hierarchical data models. You don't have to set any specific properties to display hierarchical data. Each publicly exposed property in the assigned business object is assigned a corresponding field in the field layout. When a public property returns an object that implements the IEnumerable interface, the grid will display an expansion indicator to allow the user to drill down into the hierarchy. To bind to XML data, the data must be assigned to an XML data provider. XPath is used to point the data source to the list of objects. As with any other use of XML data provider, XML can be declared in a resource dictionary or a separate XML file. The XAML here shows an XML data provider declared in the resource dictionary of a XAM data grid, and the data source of the grid is assigned to a specified path in the XML data. If the data comes from a code source, such as a list of defined objects with properties, you can assign the data to an observable collection and assign the collection directly to the control. The C# code on this slide illustrates this approach. Data can also be assigned by utilizing data context and binding part of the data context to the data source. You can also use Object Data Provider, and you can bind to SQL databases, flat data sets, and link queries. Now it's time for the first lab of the chapter, which covers the XAM Data Presenter. Welcome to the XAM Data Presenter lab. In this lab, we'll add a XAM Data Presenter control to the NetAdvantage lab solution and configure it to display hierarchical data as well as multiple views. This video is for Task 1 of Exercise 1, and in this task we're going to add a new user control to the project and create a new tab for it in the XAM Doc Manager. Starting in Visual Studio, in the Solution Explorer window, we're going to right-click on the View folder and select Add and then User Control. In the Add New Item dialog window, verify the user control template is selected and then enter XAM Data Presenter in the name field. We can then click Add to close the dialog window and add the user control to the project. In the XAML view of XAMDataPresenter.XAML, we'll change the width and height to auto. Next, let's move back to Window1.XAML, and we'll select the tab group pane element in XAM Doc Manager 1. In the Properties window, click the ellipsis button next to the Items property. In the Collection Editor dialog window, verify the Content pane is selected, and then click the Add button to add a Content pane object to the collection. In the Properties list, set the Content pane's Allow Docking property to False, set Allow Floating Only to False, set Header to XAM Data Presenter, and set Name to Data Presenter pane. Then click OK to close the dialog window. Next, we're going to add a declaration for the NetWPF Lab View namespace named View. Then we can build the solution. Lastly, in the XAML view of Window1.XAML, we'll add the XAM Data Presenter user control to the XAM Data Presenter content pane element and set its name property to Data Presenter View. And this completes Task 1 of Exercise 1. Welcome to Task 2 of Exercise 1 of the XAM Data Presenter Lab. In this task, we'll set up the layout of the user control and add the non-infragistics controls needed to complete the lab. We're going to start by saving our solution in Visual Studio, and then we're going to switch over to Expression Blend. Once the project is open in Expression Blend, select the grid entry in the Objects and Timeline panel. In the Properties panel under the Layout category, expand the Advanced Properties and click the ellipsis button next to the Row Definitions Collection property. In the Row Definition Collection Editor dialog window, click Add Another Item twice to add 2 row definition objects. In the Items list, let's select the first row definition object, and in the Properties list, we'll set its height to 30 pixel. Then we'll select the second row definition and verify its height is set to 1 star. Then we can click OK to close the dialog window. Next, in the Tools panel, we'll locate the Stack Panel tool and double-click it to add a new Stack Panel element to our grid. Then in the Properties panel, under the Layout category, we'll set Horizontal Alignment to Center, Vertical Alignment to Center, and Orientation to Horizontal. Next, we're going to add a button control to the Stack Panel element. In the Properties panel, we'll set its name property to Vertical View Button, and then in the Layout category, we'll set its width to 150, its margin right to 8, and all other margin sides to 0. Then under the Common Properties category, we'll set Content to Vertical View. Next, we'll add a second button control to the Stack panel, and we'll set its name to Carousel View Button, its width to 150, its margin right to 8, its margin left to 8, all other margin sides to 0, and we'll set its content to Carousel View. Next, we'll add a third button control to the Stack panel, and we'll set its name to Horizontal View Button, its width to 150, its margin left to 8, all other margin sides to 0, and its content to Horizontal View. The design view of XAMDataPresenter.xaml should have a 30 pixel height row at the top with our 3 buttons aligned horizontally. Let's go ahead and save the solution in Blend. And in the Projects panel, we'll right-click on XAMDataPresenter.xaml and select Edit in Visual Studio to move back to Visual Studio. Reload the project if Visual Studio asks you to. This completes exercise 1. Welcome to task 1 of exercise 2 of the XAMDataPresenter lab. In this task, we'll configure the XAMDataPresenter control to display hierarchical data and enable various features of the control. Starting in Visual Studio, in the Solution Explorer window, open XAMDataPresenter.xaml. First, let's add a declaration for the Infragistics Data Presenter XML namespace named IGDP. Next, we'll add a declaration for the Infragistics Windows XML namespace named IGWindows. Then we can add a XAMDataPresenter control to the root grid element below the Stack panel and set its name to XAMDataPresenter1. We'll bind its data source to customers' orders in the view model, set its grid row to 1, and set its theme to Office 2K7 Blue. Next, we'll select XAMDataPresenter1, and in the Properties window, click the ellipsis button next to the Field Layouts collection. In the Collection Editor dialog window, click Add twice to add 2 field layout objects to the collection. Select the second field entry, and in the Properties list set its parent field name property to Orders. Then click OK to close the dialog window. Next, in the XAML view of XAMDataPresenter.xaml, add a field object to the first field layout element and set its name to company name and set its label to company name with a space. Next, we're going to add 9 more fields. The fields are going to be customer ID, address, city, contact title, country, fax, phone, postal code, and orders. In the second field layout element, we're going to add 5 field objects. They're going to be employee ID, customer ID, freight, order date, and order ID. Next, we're going to set the field layout settings property of XAMDataPresenter1 to a new field layout settings object. Then we'll select the field layout settings object, and in the properties window we'll set allow field moving to yes, auto-generate fields to false, and highlight alternate records to true. Back in the XAML view, we'll set the field settings property of XAMDataPresenter1 to a new field settings object. Select the field settings element, and in the properties window we'll set allow fixing to near or far, allow record filtering to true, allow summaries to true, cell click action to select record, label click action to sort by multiple fields, summary display area to in-group by records and bottom, and summary UI type to multi-select. Once that's done, go ahead and run the project. Now you can see in the XAMDataPresenter tab, numerous features are enabled. You can test sorting, multiple field sorting, row summaries, and fixed fields. This completes Task 1 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 2 of Exercise 2. In this task, we'll use a value converter to enable conditional formatting. Starting in the XAML view of XAMDataPresenter.xaml, add a declaration for the NAWPF namespace named Resources. Next, we'll add XAML tags for the user control element's resources collection. And then in the resources collection, we'll add a declaration for the conditional formatting converter class and set its key property to conditional formatter. Conditional formatting converter is a provided value converter class. Underneath conditional formatter, we'll add a style object and set its key to conditional formatting style and its target type to cell value presenter. Next, we'll put a setter object into the style and set its property to foreground and set its value to a new binding with its converter set to conditional formatter and its relative source set to self. Next, we'll locate the freight field in XAMPP Data Presenter 1 and set its field settings property to a new field settings object with its cell value presenter style property bound to the style that we just created. Then we can run the project. Now if you click the XAMPP Data Presenter tab and expand one of the parent rows, the freight field's text should be colored green if it's below 50 and blue if it's above 50. And this completes Task 2 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 3 of Exercise 2 of the XAMPP Data Presenter Lab. In this task, we'll add functionality to toggle between views in the XAMPP Data Presenter. Starting in the XAML view of XAMPP-DataPresenter.xaml, we're going to add a grid view object to the resources collection of the user control and set its key property to normal grid view. Next, we're going to add a carousel view object with its key property set to carousel view. And lastly, we're going to add a second grid view object to the resources collection with its key property set to horizontal grid view. For horizontal grid view, we're going to set the orientation property of its view settings object to horizontal. Next, let's locate the vertical view button in the XAML and add an event handler for its click event named ViewButtonClick. Then we're going to add the same event handler to carousel view button and horizontal view button. Next, let's right-click on the event handler text for any of these three and select Navigate to Event Handler. This will take us to the code behind file. Inside the ViewButtonClick event handler, we're first going to cast sender to a button and create a switch statement to check the name property of the button. Next, we're going to add a case for vertical view button that assigns the normal grid view resource to the view property of XAMPP Data Presenter 1. Next, we'll add a case for carousel view button. This time we're going to add the carousel view resource. And lastly, we're going to add a case for horizontal view button using the horizontal grid view resource. And then we can run the project. Clicking the various buttons at the top of the XAMPP Data Presenter user control will now switch the XAMPP Data Presenter to the appropriate view. This completes Task 3 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 4 of Exercise 2 of the XAMPP Data Presenter Lab. In this task, we're going to add code to show the Grid Tools contextual tab when the XAMPP Data Presenter content pane is active. We're going to start in the code behind file of window1.xaml. And the first thing we're going to do is add the Infragistics Windows Data Presenter namespace to the top of the file. Next, inside the Active Document Changed event handler, we'll add a new case for the XAMPP Data Presenter content pane that makes the Grid Tools contextual tab in XAMPP Ribbon 1 visible. This case should be added above the default case. Then we can go ahead and run the project. The Grid Tools contextual tab should now be visible since XAMPP Data Presenter is the only selectable tab in the XAMPP Doc Manager. As we add more tabs, you'll see it change visibility based on the selected tab. And this completes the XAMPP Data Presenter lab. The XAMPP Data Grid control uses the grid view in the XAMPP Data Presenter and arranges data in tabular rows and columns. Records are used to represent each data item per row, and fields within columns are used to describe the attributes and properties which make up each record. The XAMPP Data Grid automatically detects each type of data from the data source and generates specific field layouts for each type. The ADO.NET library contains system.data.datatable. Datatable works well for storing a table of data. XAMPP Data Grid can bind directly to a data table's default view property. The code and XAML samples on the slide illustrate this approach. The object returned by the default view property implements iBinding lists, which works similar to observable collection. Any data source which implements iBinding lists can support the user adding records at runtime. The XAML shown here shows certain properties in the field layout settings which are used for enabling adding and deleting records at runtime. To allow users to add new records, you have to enable the Allow Add New property in the field layout settings. The data must implement the iBinding list interface to support this feature. You can position the Add New Record control by setting the Add New Record location property. By default, the end user can delete records from the XAMPP Data Grid by selecting the record and pressing the Delete key. The Allow Delete property controls the deletion of rows. The record added, records deleted, and record updated events can be used to update your data source if needed. Fields can be added to records which are not in the original source. These are called unbound fields. You can use unbound fields for a variety of purposes, such as displaying a calculated value, displaying a complex property in your business object, or displaying any type of content which cannot be represented in your data model, such as an interactive control. By default, the Data Presenter will generate fields, headers, and labels for data in a Data Presenter control which best suits the data. However, the layout for the grid and the presentation of each field can be customized. To display an element other than a XAMPP editor, you can style the presenter with a template. This enables you to display an image or an interactive element such as a radio button or rich text box. The XAML here illustrates how to override the default layout for a grid to arrange the data along rows within each record. All NetAdvantage WPF controls derived from the Data Presenter base class have built-in support for selection of cells, records, and fields. There are 3 different selection modes available on the selection type enumeration. The first one is None, which allows no selection. The second one is Single, which allows selection of one object at a time. And the last one, Extended, allows selection of multiple objects at a time, either programmatically or by the user holding down the Shift or Control key as they select by clicking their mouse button. The XAMPP Data Grid allows tooltips to be added to the scroll bar. The tooltip will display the value of one field in the record. The IsScrollTip field property determines that field. You can remove the tooltips while maintaining the performance of the deferred scrolling by changing the scrolling mode property to deferred. Setting scrolling mode to immediate will cause the grid to scroll each record in view as you drag the scroll bar thumb. Deferred scrolling is a performance optimization because virtualization prevents each record from coming into memory until it is scrolled into view. The XAMPP Data Grid control allows end users to move fields around at runtime. If your users need to reorganize the fields in a field layout, they can drag a field and drop it in a different location relative to the other fields within the same field layout. They can even stack fields vertically on top of each other. If you want to modify this behavior, you can set the Allow Field Moving property of a Field Layout Settings object to an Allow Field Moving enumeration value. Note that you cannot move fields between 2 different field layouts. For example, if you have a hierarchical XAMPP data grid, you cannot move a field from a parent record to a child record and vice versa. By default, XAMPP Data Grid enables field moving. However, you can disable field moving by setting the Allow Field Moving property. The XAMPP Data Presenter and XAMPP Data Grid controls allow your end users to fix fields to an edge of the control based on the record orientation and flow direction of the control. With this feature enabled, your end users can click the pin icon displayed in a field's header, or they can drag a splitter over the fields they want to fix. Both methods are shown in the screenshots here. You can repeat field headers in XAMPP Data Presenter and XAMPP Data Grid by setting the header placement property and/or header placement in group by property exposed by the field layout settings object. Users can be given the ability to select row summaries for a field in XAMPP Data Grid by setting the Allow Summaries property of a field settings object to true. When you set the Allow Summaries property to true, XAMPP Data Grid will display a summary button in the field labels. You can retrieve a summary result object by indexing into a summary results collection off a records collection in XAMPP Data Grid. Grid records can be filtered to view a smaller subset of the original data. You can expose record filtering functionality to your end users in two different ways: a filter record or a filter icon in the field headers. If you use the filter record, your end users will be able to choose an operand and an operator from a drop-down list. Note the filter record and filter icons are only available when you use a grid view. Note the filter record and filter icons are only available when you use a grid view, in other words when using the XAMPP Data Grid or XAMPP Data Presenter. However, you can add filter conditions to XAMPP Data Carousel in XAML or in procedural code. It's time for the last lab in the chapter, which covers the XAMPP Data Grid control. Welcome to the XAMPP Data Grid lab. In this lab, we'll learn how to bind data to the XAMPP Data Grid and implement many of its features including create, read, update, and delete functionality, masking, data errors, and clipboard operations. This video is for Task 1 of Exercise 1. In this task, we're going to add a new user control to the project and create a tab for it in the XAMPP Doc Manager. We'll start in Visual Studio, and in the Solution Explorer window, we're going to right-click on the View folder and select Add, and then User Control. In the Add New Item dialog window, verify the user control template is selected and enter XAMPP Data Grid in the name field. Click Add to close the dialog window and add the control to the project. Next, in the XAML view of datagrid.xaml, change the width and height properties to auto. In the Solution Explorer window, let's double-click window1.xaml to open it. Select the Tab Group pane element in XAMPP Doc Manager 1. Then in the Properties window, click the ellipsis button next to the Items property. In the Collection Editor dialog window, verify Content pane is selected in the Item dropdown, and then click the Add button to add a new Content pane object to the collection. Verify the new Content pane is selected, and then in the Properties list, set Allow Docking to False, set Allow Floating Only to False, set Header to XAMPP Data Grid, and set Name to Data Grid pane. Then click OK to close the dialog window and add the content pane to the XAMPP Doc Manager. Next, let's build the solution. And then in the XAML view of window1.xaml, we'll add a XAMPP Data Grid user control to the XAMPP Data Grid content pane element and set its name property to Data Grid view. And this completes Task 1 of Exercise 1. Welcome to Task 2 of Exercise 1 of the XAMPP Data Grid Lab. In this task, we'll set up the layout of the user control and add the non-infragistics controls needed to complete the lab. To start, let's save our solution in Visual Studio, and then we'll switch over to Expression Blend. Once XAMPP-DataGrid.xaml is open in Expression Blend, select the grid entry in the Objects and Timeline panel. In the Properties panel, under the Layout category, click the ellipsis button next to the Row Definitions Collection property. In the Row Definition Collection Editor dialog window, click Add Another Item twice to add 2 row definition objects. Next, select the first row definition object in the list and verify its height is set to 1 star. Then select the second row definition object in the list and set its height to 40 pixel. Then click OK to close the dialog window. Next, add a stack panel control to the grid. Then in the Properties panel, under Layout, set the stack panel's grid row to 1, set its orientation to horizontal, set horizontal alignment to center, and set vertical alignment to center. Next, we'll add a button control to the stack panel. In the Properties panel, set the name property of the button to Save Button. Then under Layout, set its width to 70, set margin right to 4, and set all other margin sides to 0. Next, in the Common Properties category, set Content to Save. Now let's add a second button control to the stack panel. And for this button, we're going to set Name to Cancel Button, set width to 70, set margin left to 4, set all other margin sides to 0, and set Content to Cancel. You should now have two buttons in the design view of xamdataGrid.xaml. Let's save our solution in Expression Blend, and then switch back to Visual Studio. And this completes Task 2 of Exercise 1. Welcome to Task 1 of Exercise 2 of the XamDataGrid Lab. In this task, we're going to bind the XamDataGrid control to some data, configure its field layout, and enable the addition and deletion of rows. We're going to start in xamdataGrid.xaml in Visual Studio. The first thing we're going to do is add a namespace declaration for the data presenter, editors, and system namespaces to the user control element. Next, we'll add a XamDataGrid control to the grid element and set its name to XamDataGrid1, set its theme to Office 2K7 Blue, and set its data source to a new binding pointing to Customers Orders Dataset.Tables Customers. Next, we'll set the Field Layouts property of XamDataGrid1 to a new field layout object. Now let's open the XAML view of XamDataPresenter.xaml. Locate the first field layout in the XamDataPresenter, and we're going to copy the company name, customer ID, address, city, contact title, country, fax, phone, and postal code fields. Then switch back to the XAML view of XamDataGrid.xaml and paste the field elements into the new field layout object. Next, select XamDataGrid1. In the Properties window, click the drop-down arrow in the entry field of the Field Layout Settings property and select Field Layout Settings. This will assign a new Field Layout Settings object to the property, and it will expand the property list. Under Field Layout Settings, set Add New Record Location to On Top Fixed, set Auto-Generate Fields to False, set Allow Add New to True, and set Allow Delete to True. And then run the project. If you click the XAMPP Data Grid tab, you should see some data. You are able to add and delete rows at this point, however the changes to the data will not be persisted. And this completes Task 1 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 2 of Exercise 2. In this task, we'll add CRUD functionality to the XAMPP Data Grid. Starting in the XAML view of XAMPPDataGrid.xaml, locate Save button and add a new event handler for its click event. Next, locate Cancel button and add a new event handler for its click event. These should be two different event handlers. One should be Save button click and the other should be Cancel button click. Next, let's right-click on the event text for either of the button controls and select Navigate to Event Handler to get to the code behind file. And then, since I'm using C#, I'm going to add the NAWPF Lab view model and NAWPF Lab data access namespaces to the file. Once that's done, we can add a private member of type MainWindowViewModel to the XAMPP Data Grid class. We'll call it ViewModel. Next, in the Save button click event handler, we'll add code to retrieve the MainWindowViewModel from the user controls data context and the dataset XAMPP Data Grid 1 is bound to. Then we'll call the Save Customers and Orders method on the MainWindowViewModel to save the data. Now we'll add the same code to Cancel button click, except we're going to call the Cancel Customers and Orders method on the MainWindowViewModel instead. And now we can run the project. Now if we go to the XAMPP Data Grid tab and change some data, we can click the Cancel button to cancel our changes. If we change data again and click Save and then restart the project, our changes will be persisted. This completes Task 2 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 3 of Exercise 2. In this task, we're going to add a mask to a field using the XAMPP Masked Editor. We're going to start in the XAML view of XAMPPDataGrid.xaml, and first we're going to locate the Customer ID field element and set its settings property to a new field settings object. We're going to set the field settings object's edit as type property to a string. Next, we're going to set the editor style property of the field settings object to a new style element with its target type property set to XAMPP Masked Editor. Then we'll add a setter object to the style with its property set to mask and its value set to AAAAA. And then we can run the project. Now if we click the XAMPP Data Grid tab and edit some data in the Customer ID field, you'll notice the field will only allow up to 5 alphanumeric characters. This completes Task 3 of Exercise 2. Welcome to Task 4 of Exercise 2 of the XAMPP Data Grid Lab. In this task, we'll add a constraint to the company name field stating that it cannot be null, and then we'll also enable data error support. Starting in the XAML view of XAMPPDataGrid.xaml, locate the company name field element and set its settings property to a new field settings object, with its edit as type property set to a string. Then we're going to set the editor style property of the field settings object to a new style element with its target type property set to a value editor. Then we'll add a setter to the style, setting its property to value constraint and its value to a value constraint element with its nullable property set to false. Next, we'll add a second setter object with its property set to invalid value behavior and its value set to retain value. Then we're going to add some XAML tags for the style's triggers collection. Next, we'll add a trigger to the triggers collection with its property set to isValueValid and its value set to false. Then we'll add a setter to the trigger object setters collection with its property set to border brush and its value set to red. Next, we'll locate the field layout settings object in XAMDataGrid 1 and select it. In the Properties window, set its data error display mode to error icon and highlight, and set its support data error info property to records and cells. And once that's done, we can run the project. Now you'll notice in the XAMDataGrid when you add or delete rows, the editor will be styled accordingly if the value in the company name field is left empty. And this completes task 4 of exercise 2. Welcome to task 5 of exercise 2 of the XAMDataGrid lab. In this task, we'll add code to show the Grid Tools contextual tab when the XAMDataGrid content pane is active. We're going to start in the code behind file of window1.xaml. Inside the active document changed event handler, we'll add a new case for the XAMDataGrid content pane that makes the Grid Tools contextual tab in XAMRibbon1 visible. This should be added above the default case. Then we can run the project. Now if we click on the XAMDataGrid tab, the Grid Tools contextual tab should be visible. This completes task 5 of exercise 2. Welcome to task 6 of exercise 2 of the XAMDataGrid lab. In this task, we're going to enable clipboard operations on the XAMDataGrid. Starting in the XAML view of XAMDataGrid.xaml, we'll locate the field layout settings object in XAMDataGrid 1 and select it. In the Properties window, we're going to set Allow Clipboard Operations to All. Next, we'll open the code behind file of window1.xaml. In the button tool click event handler, we'll add a case to the switch statement for the cut tool. In this case, we'll verify the cut command can be executed, and if so, execute it. Next, we'll add a case to the switch statement for the copy tool. In this case, we'll verify the copy command can be executed and execute it. Next, we'll add a case for the paste tool, doing the same thing. Then we'll add a case for the undo tool. And lastly, we'll add a case for the redo tool. Then we can run the project. Now, if you select the XAMPP Data Grid tab and select some text, you can test the copy, cut, paste, undo, and redo functionality. This completes the XAMPP Data Grid lab.